Zorvac sat in his small, dimly lit room at the Galactic Academy, staring at the huge pile of research papers spread out in front of him. His fingers drummed nervously on the desk. It was the final week before the big presentation. And he had nothing. His mind was blank, his calculations were wrong, and his research paper was a mess. Zorvac had always been one of the smartest students of the Academy, but this time, nothing seemed to work. The topic of his research was complex, solving advanced equations that even the brightest minds in the galaxy struggled with. The equations were tricky, involving multiple variables that seemed to spiral out of control the more he worked on them. Zorvac had tried every trick in the book: advanced algorithms, super-fast computers, and even consulting his fellow alien students. But every solution he found didn't add up. His equations just wouldn't work. Frustration filled Zorvac's chest. He paced back and forth in his room. His professors were known for being harsh, and they had high expectations. If he failed, his academic career would be over before it even started. He couldn't let that happen. He needed a breakthrough. He needed an idea that no one else had thought of. Then, something caught his attention. He remembered an old story he'd heard in his first year at the Academy. A story about a strange species from a distant planet. The humans. They were known for being resourceful and clever, solving problems that no one else could, even without the advanced technology most other species had. Zorvac had always been fascinated by these humans. They didn't rely on computers or fancy gadgets. Instead, they solved problems the old-fashioned way, by using their minds and hands. Zorvac stopped pacing. An idea began to form in his mind. What if he could solve his problem using human methods? What if their old-fashioned ways were actually the answer he had been searching for? Zorvac had heard of humans solving incredibly complex equations by hand, using nothing but their brains and simple tools. Could their methods work for his research? He had to find out. Without wasting another moment, Zorvac grabbed his datapad and began searching through the Academy's archives for any information on human mathematics. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew one thing: if humans had done this without advanced technology, there must be something in their approach that he was missing. After a few minutes of searching, Zorvac found a dusty file buried deep in the archives. It was labeled Ancient Human Methods. His heart raced as he opened the file. Inside, he found records of human mathematicians who had solved huge problems without the help of modern tools. They used basic methods, like paper and pencil, to calculate numbers that seemed impossible to Zorvac. These humans had written down every step of their calculations by hand, showing how they worked through even the toughest problems. Zorvac's eyes widened as he read through the records. The humans didn't just solve problems. They created entirely new methods of calculation that were now considered ancient but brilliant. They had used simple principles, like dividing problems into smaller steps and focusing on one thing at a time. Their process was slow, but they always found a way to get to the right answer. For the first time in weeks, Zorvac felt a spark of hope. He had been looking at the problem the wrong way. Instead of relying on technology, he could go back to basics, just like the humans had. Maybe it wasn't about speed or complex algorithms. It was about focusing on the small, simple steps that led to the solution. With a renewed sense of purpose, Zorvac started to gather the tools he would need. A simple tablet, a pencil, and some paper. He pushed aside the advanced computers and began working the way the humans had done centuries ago. Slowly, methodically, he began to rewrite his equations, breaking them down step by step. He focused on the smaller parts of the equation, working through each one carefully before moving on to the next. At first, it was difficult. The process was slow and seemed clunky compared to the fast, automated methods Zorvac was used to. But as he continued, something amazing happened. The equations started to make sense. Each step built on the last, and before long, Zorvac found himself solving problems that had seemed impossible just hours before. His hands moved across the paper with surprising ease, and for the first time in a long while, he felt confident in his work. Zorvac sat back in his chair, looking at the completed equations in front of him. He had done it. He had solved the problems, using nothing but his mind, and the simple techniques humans had once used. Zorvac couldn't believe it. He had spent weeks trying to solve these equations using the most advanced technology in the galaxy, but it was the old human methods that had finally worked. A smile spread across Zorvac's face. He had found the breakthrough he needed, but there was one more thing he had to do. Zorvac knew that he couldn't just keep this discovery to himself. If humans had solved these problems long ago, then maybe their methods were worth sharing with the galaxy. He decided that his research paper wouldn't just be about solving equations. It would be about showing the galaxy how brilliant humans truly were. But first, he had to make sure no one found out where he had gotten his ideas from. Zorvac couldn't believe how simple the solution had been. Just a few hours ago, he had been lost in a sea of complicated equations, surrounded by advanced technology that promised to solve everything. But now, sitting in his quiet room, his mind was racing with excitement. He had found the answer in the most unexpected place: human math. Humans had figured it out centuries ago, using nothing but paper, pencil, and raw creativity. Zorvac knew he had to learn more. The simple methods humans had used to solve their problems fascinated him, and he couldn't stop thinking about how their approach was different from anything he had ever seen. He was eager to dive deeper into human research, to understand how they managed to accomplish such brilliant feats with such basic tools. The next day, Zorvac hurried to the Galactic Library. It was the largest library in the galaxy, containing knowledge from all over the universe. But today, he wasn't interested in alien technologies or new research methods. Today, his mind was focused on one thing: human genius. The library was quiet, with only a few other students browsing through holographic displays or reading the latest scientific journals. Zorvac walked past rows of glowing data pads, but he didn't stop. He knew exactly where to go. At the back of the library, in a dusty, forgotten corner, were the human archives. These were old, handwritten documents from Earth, the home planet of humans. They were rare and highly valued for their historical importance. Zorvac approached the shelves, scanning the titles with curiosity. He had seen these books before, but had never thought much of them. Now, they seemed like hidden treasures. His eyes landed on a thick book titled The Genius of Human Mathematics. Without hesitation, he pulled it off the shelf and opened the first page. The book was filled with stories about human mathematicians, ordinary people who had solved extraordinary problems. Zorvac couldn't believe what he was reading. These humans had calculated vast numbers, discovered patterns, and solved equations that seemed impossible, all by hand. They didn't have the advanced machines or quantum computers that other species had. They didn't even rely on the most basic tools like calculators. They used pencils, paper, and their own brains. One story stood out to Zorvac. It was about a human mathematician named Isaac, who had solved a difficult problem using nothing but a chalkboard and a few simple ideas. Isaac had no fancy technology, but he had something far more valuable: his creativity. He broke down the problem into small, manageable steps and solved it by focusing on each piece, one at a time. The story made Zorvac stop and think. It wasn't just that humans could solve problems. It was the way they did it. They approached challenges in a completely different way than anyone else. Zorvac turned the pages faster now, eager to find more stories. He read about mathematicians who had discovered new kinds of numbers, drawn complex geometric shapes, and solved equations no one else had even thought to try, all without the help of machines. The more Zorvac read, the more he realized that human genius wasn't about having the best technology. It was about thinking differently, about seeing the world in new ways. He spent hours in the library, soaking up everything he could find about human mathematics. Each story, each discovery, left him in awe. He learned about human methods that focused on simplicity, breaking down complex problems into smaller ones, finding patterns in numbers, and using logical thinking to guide them toward solutions. Zorvak realized that humans didn't just solve equations. They approached them with patience and determination. They trusted their own minds and skills, and that was what made them truly exceptional. As the sun began to set outside, Zorvak closed the last book with a sigh. His head was spinning with new ideas. The human way of thinking was so different from the advanced methods he was used to. But it made sense. Humans were small in number and lacking in technology, but they had achieved so much because they didn't rely on shortcuts. They used the tools they had, no matter how simple, and pushed the limits of what was possible. Zorvak felt a deep respect for humans now, something he hadn't expected. They had accomplished so much with so little, and their way of solving problems was inspiring. He had thought that advanced technology was the key to everything, but humans had shown him something different. They didn't need the best tools or the fastest computers. They just needed their minds. The more Zorvak thought about it, the more he realized that humans had a unique kind of genius. Their strength wasn't in their technology, but in their creativity and determination. They had solved problems that no one else could, using nothing but their minds and a few basic tools. Zorvak couldn't help but feel a little humbled. Here he was, a student at the most advanced academy in the galaxy, surrounded by the latest technology. And yet humans had done things that seemed impossible without any of it. Zorvak sat back in his chair, staring at the stacks of human books in front of him. He had discovered something amazing, something that no one in the galaxy had fully appreciated until now. He had found human genius, and he wasn't going to let anyone forget it. Zorvak sat at his desk, staring at the pile of notes and papers in front of him. He had spent hours the day before in the library, reading about human methods of solving complex math problems. The simple, patient way they approached challenges had opened his eyes. Now, with a new sense of confidence, he was ready to put everything he had learned into his research paper. The paper had been a disaster before. Zorvak had tried everything. Advanced algorithms, complicated calculations, and even powerful computers. But nothing worked. The equations didn't add up, and he couldn't find the right answers. But now, everything was different. The old human methods had given him a new direction, one that didn't rely on speed or technology. He was going to take it slow, focus on each step, and let the logic guide him. He grabbed his tablet, opened the file for his paper, and began to rewrite the introduction. He started with a simple statement. Mathematics is not just about numbers. It's about understanding patterns and breaking down problems. He smiled to himself. This was a different approach, and it felt right. Zorvak picked up a pencil and began to work through the first equation. Instead of rushing, he carefully broke it down into smaller pieces. He used the same method that human mathematicians had used, focusing on one step at a time. It was slow, but it made sense. The numbers seemed to fall into place. As he worked, he remembered the story of Isaac, the human mathematician who had solved a complicated problem on a chalkboard by breaking it down step by step. Zorvak was doing the same thing now, and it felt like a victory in itself. As he moved from one equation to the next, Zorvak noticed something strange. His calculations were coming out correctly, but they weren't just right. They were cleaner, simpler. He had been trying to solve these problems using the most advanced technology in the galaxy, and yet these basic methods were giving him better results. He felt a sense of awe as he realized that the human way of thinking wasn't just different, it was better in many ways. Zorvak's confidence grew with each passing hour. The paper was starting to take shape. He had written out the first few equations clearly and methodically. The calculations were precise, the answers were correct, and everything seemed to make sense. It was as if the human methods had unlocked something in his mind, a new way of thinking that he hadn't considered before. The sun was setting outside, casting a warm orange glow across his desk. Zorvak glanced at the clock. It had been a long day, but he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had solved problems that had seemed impossible just days ago. His paper was coming together in ways he hadn't imagined, and it felt like he was on the verge of something big. But Zorvak wasn't finished yet. he still had to test his ideas to make sure everything was perfect. He couldn't just present the paper without confirming that it worked. He took a deep breath and picked up another pencil. This time, he was going to go through the equations again, one by one. He had to be sure that each step made sense and that nothing had been missed. As he worked through the calculations again, he realized something important. This wasn't just about solving equations anymore. It was about showing everyone that there was more to mathematics than just advanced technology. The human methods had shown him that sometimes the best solutions were the simplest ones. Humans didn't rely on fancy machines or fast computers. They relied on their minds, their creativity, and their ability to see things differently. That was their true genius. Zorvak paused for a moment, looking at his paper. It wasn't just a research project anymore. It was a tribute to human brilliance. He had found a new way to approach his work, one that didn't rely on the latest gadgets or the most powerful tools. Instead, he had learned to think like a human, to break down problems and approach them with patience and focus. Zorvak sat nervously in the classroom, staring at the data pad in front of him. His research paper was finally finished. He had put everything he had into it, carefully following the human methods, breaking down complex equations step by step, and using the simplest tools available. It had worked perfectly. The numbers matched up, the equations made sense, and he was confident his work would impress the professors. But now, he was about to present it to Professor Verka, the toughest professor at the Galactic Academy. Professor Verka was known for her sharp mind and her unshakable belief in advanced technology. She didn't believe in the old ways of doing things. She always pushed for cutting-edge methods and fast, high-tech solutions. Zorvak couldn't help but wonder what she would think of his work. Would she see the brilliance in the simplicity of human math, or would she dismiss it as outdated? The room was filled with students, all sitting at their desks with their own research papers in front of them. Zorvak could hear the quiet hum of the data pads as his classmates made last-minute changes to their papers. He glanced around, trying to calm his nerves. He had already written his paper, but presenting it was a different story. He had to be ready for anything. Professor Verka walked into the room, her sharp eyes scanning the students. She was tall, with her silver hair tied back in a neat bun. She had a reputation for being fair, but extremely demanding. Zorvak had always admired her intelligence, but he also knew that her standards were incredibly high. The thought of disappointing her made his stomach turn. "Today, we'll hear your final research presentations," Professor Verka said, her voice cold but commanding. "You have 1 hour to present your findings and answer any questions. Make sure your work is flawless." Zorvak stood up with his data pad in hand and walked to the front of the room. His heart pounded in his chest as he set the pad on the podium and glanced up at the professor. She was already looking at him with an expression that told him she expected nothing less than perfection. "Zorvak, what do you have for us today?" Professor Verka asked, her tone both curious and skeptical. Zorvak cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "I've been working on a set of equations involving advanced mathematical problems," he began. "At first, I used the usual methods, but I wasn't able to get the answers I needed. Then, I remembered something I read about the human mathematicians from Earth. They used simple methods, pen and paper, to solve problems that seemed impossible with technology." Professor Verka raised an eyebrow. "Human methods. I fail to see how ancient techniques can be relevant in solving modern problems. You're saying you relied on something so basic?" Zorvak nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, Professor. Instead of relying on advanced computers or algorithms, I broke down the equations step by step, like the humans did. I found that by focusing on one part of the problem at a time, the equations began to make sense. I used the simplest tools, a pencil and paper, just as humans did hundreds of years ago." The professor's eyes narrowed slightly. She seemed to be processing what he had said. "And these methods led you to the correct answers?" Zorvak smiled, a little relieved. "Yes, Professor. In fact, I believe they gave me better results than I would have gotten using traditional methods." Professor Verka didn't speak for a moment. She simply stared at Zorvek, as if trying to read his every thought. The room was silent. Zorvek felt a sudden sense of doubt creeping in. Had he said too much? Would the professor dismiss his work as a waste of time? He could almost feel her skepticism hanging in the air. Finally, she spoke, her voice sharp and filled with suspicion. "I see. Well, let's take a look at your equations." She gestured to the data pad on the podium, and Zorvek pressed a button to bring up his work. As the professor read through the calculations, Zorvek could see her brow furrow. She tapped a few commands into her own data pad, comparing the numbers. He watched as she paused, then glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "Zorvek," she said slowly, "these equations, they're correct. But they are far too simple for something as complex as what you've claimed. It's almost as if you've taken the answers from somewhere else." Zorvek's heart skipped a beat. He knew what she was implying. The last thing he wanted was for Professor Verka to accuse him of cheating. "I swear, Professor, I did the work myself. I didn't take anything from anyone." The professor studied him for a long moment. "I'm not accusing you of cheating," she said, her tone softening a little. "But I do have one question. Why would you choose such a basic method to solve these equations? If you had the knowledge and tools to do it the traditional way, why resort to something so primitive?" Zorvek's mind raced. He had to think quickly. "I chose this method because it works," he said. "The humans did it. They didn't have the advanced technology we have now, but they found ways to solve problems with the simplest tools available to them. I wanted to see if their approach could still work today." Professor Verka didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she nodded, but there was still a hint of suspicion in her eyes. "I'll need to review your paper more carefully. For now, I suggest you prepare for any questions that may come up. Your methods may have worked this time, but I expect you to explain them clearly." Zorvek nodded quickly, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The professor hadn't accused him outright, but she was clearly suspicious. He knew he had to be extra careful from now on. The last thing he wanted was for anyone to discover where he had gotten his ideas from. The days that followed Zorvek's presentation were filled with tension. Professor Verka had accepted his paper for review, but she was far from satisfied. Every time they crossed paths in the halls or during class, Zorvek could feel her eyes on him, as if she was waiting for him to slip up. She had questions, lots of them, and Zorvek knew she was determined to find out more about how he had come to the conclusions in his research. Zorvek tried to focus on his other studies, but his mind kept drifting back to the paper. His method had worked, but it was so simple, so basic, that he was beginning to feel uneasy. Could he really convince Professor Verka and the others that this method, this human approach, was the future of mathematics? He wasn't sure. What if they saw it as a weakness instead of a strength? It was late one evening when Zorvek was working late in the library, reviewing his research again. He had already gone over the equations countless times, but something about the way Professor Verka had looked at him that day still bothered him. Her suspicion lingered in the air, like an unsolved problem hanging over his head. He needed answers, and he needed to find them fast. As he was lost in thought, he heard footsteps approaching. Zorvek looked up, startled, and saw Professor Verka standing at the entrance to the study room. Her expression was serious, her eyes piercing. "Zorvek," she said, her voice cold but calm. "We need to talk." Zorvek's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this moment, but now that it had arrived, he wasn't sure how to handle it. He swallowed nervously and stood up, walking over to the professor. "Professor Verka, what can I do for you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your paper," she said bluntly. "I've reviewed it again. Something doesn't add up, and I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Zorvek's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, Professor?" Professor Verka took a step closer, her gaze never leaving him. "Your paper is too simple. It's almost as if you're hiding something. I've seen this before. Students try to take shortcuts, pretending to use human methods when, in reality, they're taking the easy way out. Zorvak felt his face flush. Professor, I swear I didn't take any shortcuts. I did the work myself. She raised an eyebrow, a skeptical smile playing at the corners of her lips. You expect me to believe that you, one of the brightest students in this academy, came up with all of this by yourself, using only pencil and paper. You've been studying the latest technologies, and yet you chose the simplest method available. Why? Zorvak hesitated. He had always admired Professor Verka's sharp intellect, but now he found himself at a loss for words. She wasn't accusing him outright of cheating, but the suspicion in her voice was undeniable. He had to explain himself, but how could he make her understand? How could he make her see the value of the human approach? I chose it because it works, he said, his voice firmer now. The humans didn't have the technology we have now, but they solved problems with the simplest methods. They didn't rely on computers or fancy gadgets. They used their minds. And I wanted to see if their way of thinking could work today. I didn't take any shortcuts, Professor. I did it the same way they did, step by step. Professor Verka studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. So, you're saying that you solved these complex equations by following the same methods as humans did hundreds of years ago? Zorvak nodded. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. A silence fell between them. Zorvak could feel the weight of the professor's gaze, her sharp eyes searching for any hint of deception. He stood his ground, trying to remain calm, but the tension in the room was thick. Finally, Professor Verka spoke again, her voice softer this time. I believe you, Zorvak, but I need you to understand something. There's more at play here than just solving equations. Your paper may be correct, but it's not about how you arrived at the answers. It's about how you present your ideas. Simplicity isn't always the best approach. People need to see the power of your work, the strength of your methods. You're not just proving that you can solve a problem. You're proving that your way of thinking is the future of mathematics. Zorvak blinked, trying to process her words. So, you want me to change my approach? Professor Verka nodded slowly. Not change it, but refine it. Present it in a way that shows its true potential. Show them that this method isn't just an old human trick. It's a new way of thinking that can revolutionize mathematics. You can't just rely on simplicity. You need to show why simplicity is powerful. Zorvak felt a spark of understanding. He had been so focused on the human methods themselves that he hadn't thought about how to make others see their value. It wasn't enough to solve the equations. It was about showing the galaxy that these old methods had a place in the future. Thank you, Professor, Zorvak said, a sense of clarity settling over him. I understand now. I'll refine my paper and present it the right way. Professor Verka gave him a small, approving nod. Good. You have potential, Zorvak. Don't waste it by hiding behind simplicity. As she turned to leave, Zorvak felt a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation had been difficult, but it had given him the answers he needed. He wasn't just going to present his paper as a simple solution. He was going to show everyone the brilliance of human thought, the power of simplicity, and how it could shape the future. Zorvak smiled to himself. The real work was just beginning. Zorvak sat at his desk late into the night, his data pad glowing brightly in the darkness. Professor Verka's words echoed in his mind. You're not just solving equations, you're showing them the power of simplicity. It was clear now. He had to present his research in a way that highlighted the true strength of human methods. But how? How could he make others see the brilliance of simplicity in a galaxy full of complex technology? He sighed and rubbed his eyes, then turned his attention back to the datapad. The equations on the screen seemed so much more complicated now. Zorvak had always admired the speed and power of modern technology, but after his conversation with the professor, he realized that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most powerful. Zorvak had heard a lot about humans over the years, how their species had overcome incredible challenges, how they had created works of art, music, and science without relying on the advanced technology the other species used. Humans had done it all with their minds and hands, with creativity and persistence. Zorvac had studied their history, read about their discoveries, and even watched documentaries about their great achievements. But until now, he had never truly understood what made their methods so powerful. It was time to learn from them. The next morning, Zorvac decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing on the equations themselves, he would focus on how the humans had solved problems. He would think like they did, step by step, with patience and a deep understanding of the basics. He pulled up old human textbooks, manuals, and papers, books that didn't rely on computers or advanced systems, but on simple tools like paper, pencils, and logic. Zorvac spent hours flipping through pages, reading the words of humans who had lived long before the galaxy had known advanced technology. He learned about how humans had tackled problems without the luxury of instant answers from supercomputers. They had used observation, trial and error, and deep thinking. They had studied the world around them, analyzed patterns, and came up with solutions based on their understanding of the world. It wasn't about speed or the latest gadgets. It was about the power of thought and perseverance. Zorvac smiled as he read about a famous human mathematician who had solved a seemingly impossible problem by taking a step back and considering the simplest possible approach. The human had used basic tools, a ruler, a compass, and a bit of paper, and had solved a problem that had baffled the smartest minds of the time. Zorvac saw the beauty in that. It wasn't about doing things the fast way or the easy way. It was about finding the right way. With a renewed sense of purpose, Zorvac returned to his equations. He took out a piece of paper and a pencil, just like the humans would have done. He began to work through the equations by hand, carefully writing down each step and thinking through the logic behind every calculation. It was slow, but it felt different. It felt right. As he worked, Zorvac realized something important. The process itself was just as valuable as the answers. Each step was a small victory, each calculation a piece of the larger puzzle. The more he focused on the simplicity of the methods, the more he saw the genius behind them. Zorvac spent the next few days refining his paper. He worked tirelessly, making sure that his presentation would not only show the answers, but also explain why human methods were so effective. He didn't just want to solve the equations. He wanted to show the galaxy that even in a world full of advanced technology, sometimes the simplest tools and the most basic approaches were the most powerful. By the time Zorvac was ready to present his revised paper, he felt a new sense of confidence. He had learned something important from the humans. Their strength didn't lie in their technology or their speed. It lay in their ability to think deeply, to break things down, and to solve problems with patience and creativity. Zorvac realized that the same could be true for him. He didn't need to rely on the most advanced tools to solve problems. He just needed to trust in his ability to think and reason like the humans did. When the day of the presentation arrived, Zorvac walked into the classroom with a renewed sense of purpose. His heart still raced, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from excitement. He knew that his paper wasn't just about solving equations. It was about showing the power of simplicity, the brilliance of human thought. Professor Verka was sitting at the front of the room, waiting for him. She gave him a nod of acknowledgement, and Zorvac stepped forward to present his work. This time, he didn't just focus on the answers. He explained the process, the step-by-step approach that had worked for humans long before technology had taken over. He showed how each calculation built on the last, how patience and careful thought had led him to the solution. He made sure to explain the beauty in simplicity, just as the humans had done centuries ago. As Zorvac finished his presentation, he looked up at the professor. Her expression was unreadable, but he could tell she was impressed. She didn't speak immediately, but when she did, her voice was calm and thoughtful. "Zorvac," she said, "I see now that you've learned something valuable. You've learned to think like a human, not just in terms of equations, but in terms of the process. Your work is impressive, and your presentation is clear. You've shown that simplicity isn't a weakness, it's a strength. Zorvak smiled, feeling a sense of pride. He had done it. He had learned from the humans, and in doing so, he had unlocked a new way of thinking. It wasn't just about using the latest technology, it was about using his mind, just as the humans had done. As the class ended, and the students began to file out of the room, Zorvak felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had solved the problem, but more importantly, he had learned something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The lesson of simplicity, of thinking deeply and solving problems with patience and creativity, was something he would carry with him always. Zorvak stood outside the lecture hall, feeling a rush of excitement. His presentation had gone better than he had ever hoped. Professor Verka's approval was the spark he needed, but the real triumph was the feeling of clarity that had washed over him. For the first time since he'd started his studies, Zorvak felt that he had truly found his place. He wasn't just a student following the path laid out for him by others. He was forging his own way forward, a way inspired by the simplicity and brilliance of humans. It was an odd feeling, one Zorvak couldn't quite describe. He had always thought of himself as someone who relied on technology and complex calculations. That was what had been expected of him at the academy. But now, after learning from human methods, Zorvak realized that there was a different approach, one that didn't require the latest tech or shortcuts. It was an approach based on deep thinking, patience, and an appreciation for the simplest tools. Zorvak walked through the corridors of the academy, lost in thought. The building around him was filled with the hum of advanced technology, the whirring of machines, and the flashing of screens. Yet, for the first time, all of it seemed secondary to him. He had seen the power of simplicity, the strength of human thinking, and it had changed everything. Later that afternoon, Zorvak met with Professor Verka again. She had asked to see him after class to discuss his work further. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing. This conversation would be different from all the others. He had done something no one had expected. He had taken a risk and embraced the human way of solving problems, and it had paid off. Zorvak. Professor Verka greeted him with a nod as he entered her office. "I've been thinking about your presentation all day." Zorvak felt his heart race. He had prepared himself for praise, but part of him still feared that the professor might have found something wrong. "What did you think, Professor?" "I think you've done something remarkable," she said, sitting back in her chair. "You've shown us that there's more to solving problems than using the latest technology or relying on machines. You've proven that the simplest methods can be the most effective." Zorvak smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, Professor. I've learned a lot from the humans. I believe their way of thinking has a lot to offer. It's not about complexity. It's about finding the right approach, no matter how simple it may seem." Professor Verka's eyes narrowed, as though she were deep in thought. "I think you're onto something, Zorvak. The way humans approach problems, their creativity, their ability to think outside the box, it's something we've all overlooked. You've given me a new perspective on our research methods, but there's more to be done. Your work is just the beginning." Zorvak felt a spark of excitement. "What do you mean?" "Your approach is groundbreaking," she said, "but it's only one part of a larger picture. You've shown us how valuable simplicity can be in problem solving. But now we need to explore how we can combine human thinking with the technology at our disposal. There's a balance to be found. You've made a significant first step, but there's a new path ahead of you." Zorvak felt a sense of purpose fill him. He hadn't realized it until now, but the journey he had begun wasn't just about his research paper or impressing his professors. It was about something much larger, about blending the old ways with the new, about finding a path that used the best of both worlds. "I think I understand," Zorvak said. "I don't need to abandon technology. I just need to balance it with the simplicity of human methods. There's a lot we can learn from how they solved problems with limited resources." Professor Verka smiled. "Exactly. You've discovered a new way forward. The future of our research, and perhaps even the future of mathematics and science, lies in combining the brilliance of human thought with the power of our technology. You've opened a door, Zorvac, and now it's up to you to walk through it. Zorvac felt a rush of excitement. The possibilities seemed endless. The simple methods he had learned from humans could be the key to unlocking new discoveries, to pushing the boundaries of knowledge. It was a new path, one that didn't rely on blind progress or technology for its own sake, but on balance, creativity, and clear thinking. As Zorvac left the professor's office, he felt a sense of excitement bubbling inside him. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was also full of promise. He wasn't just going to follow in the footsteps of others. He was going to create his own path, one that combined the best of both worlds. He was going to be the bridge between the old and the new, between the simplicity of human thought and the advanced technology of his own species. Zorvac knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready. Ready to walk that new path, to explore the unknown, and to bring something truly revolutionary to the galaxy. And as he stepped outside, the sun rising on a new day, Zorvac couldn't help but smile. The journey had only just begun, but he was no longer walking it alone. The lessons of the humans would guide him, and with their inspiration, he was ready to face whatever came next.